This is Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Empire of the Sun. Empire of the Sun was originally released in 2005 by GMT Games and designed by Mark Herman. This game supports 2 players and takes 6 hours to play. Before we begin this episode, I'd like to recognize the Harsh Rules Patreon supporters that help make content like this possible. If you'd like to support the channel, head over to patreon.com/harshrules to learn more. And once again, thank you for your support. Welcome back to the Harsh Rules breakdown for Empire of the Sun. In this episode, we're going to continue learning the sequence of play with the political phase. During the political phase, players determine if any countries surrender. This evaluation is made during the national status segment. A nation surrenders if the opposing player controls specific hexes. If Japan itself surrenders, the game is over and the allied player wins the game. If an allied nation surrenders, the Japanese player automatically gains control of all of its on-map airfields and ports that are not occupied by allied units, unless the specific rules for the country's surrender specifies otherwise. Keep in mind, an allied nation can only surrender once per game. Allies can retake a surrendered country by recapturing locations that the Japanese player had to capture to make the nation surrender. If they do, they regain control of all of that nation's airfields and ports, except for those that have a Japanese unit of any type in the hex. Also, as you may recall from an earlier episode, there is a card penalty for the allied player if one of their member nations surrenders to the Japanese. Even if the allies retake a nation that surrendered to Japan, they still retain this penalty. Next, we're going to tour the various countries on the game board to learn about their specific surrender conditions. Let's begin by looking at Japan. The Japanese home islands consist of Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, and Shikoku. However, for Japan to surrender, the main island of Honshu must be controlled by the allied player. Japan will also surrender if no ultimate Japanese supply source can trace a path of hexes to a resource hex for 3 consecutive national status segments. Also be aware, when invading Japan, each city hex contains an intrinsic 12 attack strength, 12 defense strength, 1-step ground unit with no stacking effects. When engaged in combat, this step is always the last one eliminated in the hex. Also, once an allied control marker is placed in a Japanese hex, this intrinsic ground step is permanently eliminated, even if the Japanese later regain control of the hex. The Marshall Islands are another location on the map that has surrender conditions. If the Allies control the hexes in red, then all islands in the Marshall Islands that do not contain Japanese land units become Allied control. Any Japanese air or naval units in hexes that change control must immediately use emergency air-naval movement to exit. Next, let's discuss restrictions regarding Manchukuo. Japanese and allied units of any type may not enter Manchukuo. However, Manchukuo may be conquered by the play of the Soviets Invade Manchuria offensive card at the appropriate time. Now, let's look at surrender conditions for allied nations. When an allied nation surrenders, it may impact the U.S.'s political will track and, in some instances, the number of cards the allied player can draw, and the number of times they may pass during the offensive phase. First, let's look at the Philippines. The Philippines surrender when the Japanese player controls Manila and Davao. If the Philippines meet these surrender conditions, the allied player subtracts 1 from their total on the political will track. Then, remove all allied ground units in Philippine hexes from play during this segment. If the unit is eligible for return to the game, such as a US HQ, it can do so through the appropriate reinforcement and HQ rules. Any U.S. air or naval units in Philippine hexes when it surrenders must use an emergency air or naval move to leave the Philippines. Any non-U.S. air and naval units are eliminated. Any Japanese air or naval units in hexes that change control back to the Allied player must immediately use emergency air naval movement to exit. Next, let's look at Malaya. Malaya surrenders when the Japanese player controls Singapore and Kuantan. This will cost the Allied player 1 space on the political will track. However, no Allied units are removed from play, nor are there hex control changes due to the surrender of Malaya. Now, what about the Dutch East Indies? They are comprised of the islands of Sumatra, Java, Borneo, Celebes, Bali, Amboina, Timor, and Morotai. The Dutch East Indies surrender when the Japanese player controls the 7 resource spaces on Sumatra, Borneo, and Java, and controls Cilacap. When the Dutch East Indies surrender, the Allied player loses 1 space on the U.S. political will track, and all Dutch units are removed from play during this segment, and the Japanese gain control of all airfields and ports that do not contain U.S. or Commonwealth ground units. Any Allied air or naval units in hexes gained by Japanese must immediately use air-naval emergency movement to exit the Dutch East Indies. Next, we're on to Burma. Burma surrenders when the Japanese control Rangoon, Mandalay, Lashio, and Myitkyina. When surrender occurs, the Allied player loses a space on the U.S. political will track and remove all Commonwealth units that have Burma in their unit designation from play during this segment. No hexes change control due to Burma surrender. Okay, let's discuss India. India is defined as having 3 parts. Northern India, which I'm showing here with the red hexes. Mainland India, the coastal hexes highlighted in pink. Please note the Japanese cannot enter these hexes, although their air-naval units can attack them. And finally, the island of Ceylon. India is too large for the Japanese to conquer, but they can make it unstable and take it out of the war, symbolized by the Gandhi peace movement. Therefore, to destabilize India, the Japanese player needs to take control of the 5 northern India hexes. If during the national status segment Japan controls all 5, then move the India marker to the left 1 space on the India status track. When the marker reaches revolts, then India essentially surrenders. Keep in mind, other events may also move the India marker towards revolt. Now, once India has surrendered, the India status marker never moves from the surrender box. Therefore, the Allied player needs to regain control of at least 1 of the 5 hexes in North India to reset the India marker back to stable. Otherwise, if India surrenders, the Allied player loses 1 space on the U.S. political will track, they draw 1 less card, but they gain 1 pass, and all Indian Commonwealth units are removed from the game. And all other Commonwealth units in mainland India are either placed on Ceylon or the Maldives Islands, or they may be permanently removed from the game if all of Ceylon and the Maldives Islands are Japanese controlled. Any Commonwealth HQs in India are involuntarily repositioned. U.S. units in India do not have to move, although they can by treating them like Commonwealth units. Hexes, the units that are moved to, must be supply eligible and not within an unneutralized Japanese aircraft zone of influence. Units that would overstack or have no legal locations to move to are permanently removed from play by the Allied player's choice. Control of hexes in mainland India does not switch to Japanese as a result of India surrendering. Allies can return to mainland India by way of amphibious assault or ground movement. The mainland India hexes are not eligible to Japanese special reaction, nor do the hexes count for progress of war if reoccupied by Allied units. In the offensive segment, following a successful China offensive, The instant the Chinese marker is in the China collapses box, China immediately surrenders. When China surrenders, the Allied player loses 2 spaces on the US political will track, draws 1 less card, but receives 1 pass. And all Allied air units in China are placed on the game turn track to return as reinforcements in the next game turn. Also note, these reinforcements may be delayed. Finally, remove all Chinese units from the game. A quick note before we move on. We will look at China in greater detail in the next episode. This will include China offensives and the China, Burma, India infrastructure projects in this region. I wanted to include it here, but the topics are just too big for this episode. Australia has 2 parts, mainland Australia and the mandates. First, let's focus in on the mainland. If all of Australia's airfields and ports, highlighted in red, are Japanese controlled during a national status segment, then Australia surrenders. Australia can only surrender once per game. Allied units can regain control of Australian mainland hexes later in the game and use them, but it doesn't undo the earlier surrender. If Australia surrenders, the Allied player loses 2 spaces on the US political will track, draws 1 less card, but gains a pass, and any Australian reinforcements that would arrive after Australia surrenders are permanently lost. Australian units already in play remain in play. Reduced Australian units that remain in play may receive replacements, but if eliminated, they are removed from the game. Next, let's look at New Guinea and the Australian mandates. For the Australian mandates, whoever controls Rabaul and Guadalcanal during the national status segment gains control of all mandate hexes that are not occupied by opposing ground units. Any opposing air and naval units and hexes that change control must immediately use emergency air-naval movement to exit. For the Allied player to regain control of the mandate, both of these hexes must be recaptured. As for New Guinea, whoever controls all the ports, plus the resource hex on New Guinea during national status segment, gains control of all named locations on New Guinea that are not occupied by opposing units. And now that we've seen all the surrender conditions for the Allied nations, let's move on to the next segment where we will record them. In the U.S. political will segment, players will update the U.S. political will marker from any Allied surrenders, as well as certain political event card plays. Please also note, when all Allied nations on this list have surrendered, reduce the U.S. political will by an additional 2 spaces. Also remember that the U.S. political will is increased by the value lost when a nation that originally surrendered is recaptured from the Japanese. During this segment, the U.S. political will can also be negatively impacted by any Japanese occupation of U.S. territories, such as Hawaii and Alaska. Let's take a closer look to see how this works. Next, let's discuss the impact of Japanese occupation of U.S. territories. The U.S. will receive a -1 to their U.S. political will track if a Japanese unit has continuously occupied any hex in the major Hawaiian Islands or Midway at the end of the second consecutive U.S. political will segment. Please be aware this result can only be earned 1 time per game. There is also a -1 to the U.S. political will track if Alaska is occupied. Alaska is considered occupied if a Japanese unit has continuously occupied any single hex in the Aleutian Islands at the end of any third consecutive U.S. political will segment. This result can only be earned 1 time per game. Once the U.S. political will segment is completed, it's on to the attrition phase. During the attrition phase, players will perform the following steps in order for both sides' air and ground units simultaneously. It's important to note that HQs and naval units are not affected by attrition. In step 1, players eliminate all reduced or single-step air or ground units that are unsupplied, not in a hex affected by an emergency supply route, or out of range of any friendly supplied or unsupplied HQs. Please note that for this check, enemy units opposing Zone of Influence and unplayable hex sides do not block the path between the HQ and the unit. Then, once all reduced or single-step air and ground units have been evaluated for supply, move on to full-strength air and ground units for Step 2. Once again, these units will be reduced if they are unsupplied or not in a hex affected by emergency supply route. And once these steps for the attrition phase are completed, it's time to move on to the next phase. The end of turn phase is basically an opportunity to check for victory before moving on to the next game turn. If the US political will marker is in the 0 box, in other words the negotiations box, during this phase, the Japanese player wins the game. On the flip side, if the conditions for automatic Allied victory have occurred, then the Allied player wins the game. This means that Japan has surrendered its main island of Honshu, or Japan has been successfully blockaded. If it is the last turn of the game, determine the winner as per the campaign or scenario victory conditions. For the full campaign, this means that Japan has been successfully strategically bombed on 4 consecutive turns, has 1 or 0 resource hexes, and a B-29 is in range of Tokyo. For a Japanese victory at this point, it means the Allies have failed to meet their objectives. However, if none of these conditions have been met, advance the game turn marker and conduct a new game turn. Also be sure to check the game board for any other markers that may need updating. And now that we've reached the end of the sequence of play, this is a good place to stop for this episode. In the next episode of this series, we will look at infrastructure as well as China. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel, click the bell icon for notifications so you'll be notified when that episode becomes available. If you found this video helpful, please give me a like and share with your friends. To be the first notified when the next episode of Harsh Rules becomes available, please hit the bell icon for notifications. And as always, this has been Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.